I'm going to talk a little bit about the contribution that I think that the ideas of Persian kingship and the ideas of empire in Iran and the wider Persianate world have contributed into our larger understanding of statecraft. And then I will focus more squarely on the figure of Cyrus the Great as this sort of epitome of the ideal ruler. Someone who features a great deal in Western narratives, in fact, much more in Western narratives and mythology than he does actually in Iran for large periods of that history. For the larger periods of the history from late antiquity onwards, the figure of Cyrus the Great basically recedes back into myth in a way that it's not explicitly sort of addressed in terms of a heroic figure. He comes back into the narrative very, very emphatically at the end of the 19th century, as we will see also in the 20th century in Iran. And in actual fact, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, quite ironically, of course, Cyrus the Great is an extremely popular figure, very counterintuitively, as you will see in a minute. But he still remains very popular in certain countries in the West. And here, with supreme irony, of course, the two countries that sort of praise Cyrus the Great to high heaven are Israel and the United States. So if we can ever get to the Cyrus Accords, we should get those three countries back to the table together again, all agreeing on one thing. Now, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Persepolis, which I know is increasingly rare these days, but if you do get the opportunity to go to Persepolis, you will notice something distinct about the way in which power is represented. If you were to go to earlier empires, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and others, most of the friezes that they have when they're showing are friezes of conquest. Murder, rape, pillage, beheading, so on and so forth. In Persepolis and other Achaemenid, the ancient Persian sites of the first of the Persian empires, you see something quite different. You see ceremonial. You see the king in his grandeur. This is Darius sitting with Xerxes, the crown prince, behind him, receiving visitors. And if you look along most of the friezes, what you see are parades of supplicants and people bearing gifts. And one of the striking things about the Achaemenid form of government, and this is one of the things I really want to emphasize in terms of Persian approaches, is that they make a clear distinction, and it's one of the first times, I think, in that sort of world historical experience, that authority becomes the primary organ of how you administer large tracts, imperial lands, rather than simple coercive power. That doesn't mean that power itself is not exercised, of course it is. But the fact is, the ancient Persian Empire in particular was not a militarized state in the way that you would find with later imperial structures, let's say even in the Persian heartlands, but certainly like, say, the Roman Empire. This was something, and you have to remember the size of the Persian Empire at this period. We're talking from the 5th to the 3rd century BC. You're talking about an empire that stretched from the Oxus, the Indus, through to Greece and up towards what we would have modern Libya. For that to be governed as a single polity required a certain sense of authority and narrative. And the narrative and mythological basis in that sense of that hegemony, if you will, required a certain understanding of a moral universe. So one of the things that I think the Persians contribute to our understanding, in a sense, of statecraft and understanding of leadership is this notion of a moral universe, in this case structured around a Zoroastrian framework, a Zoroastrian understanding. And they introduce a number of new sort of ideas into that, into our understanding. First of all is this notion that in the Zoroastrian worldview, that man is an agent of good. Okay, man is a good creation, and women, a good creation that basically is an active agent in the pursuit of good, in the assistance of the wise Lord Ahura Mazda. That means that mankind is not simply a plaything of the gods, but mankind is there, serves a purpose. Therefore, man has a role to play. Okay, so one of those things is that the king, as the sort of the link between the earthly world and the spiritual world, has a function there to basically pursue the good life, the good religion, and that sort of good moral code. So what you find there with the Persian Empire and these sort of ideas of kingship is a very key sort of sense of moral purpose. That doesn't mean, by the way, that they're always good. It just means that they always think they're right. Okay, so I mean, that's the important thing. When the Persian king says that God protect us, or wise Lord protect us from the lie, you know, modern Iranians say this shows how honest we all were and whatever, and Herodotus says, you know, all Persians were taught how to, you know, ride, shoot the bow and tell the truth. Of course, in a much more sinister way, it's actually more to do with ideology here. You know, what we're saying is the lie, you're going to get punished. I know what the truth is, and I'm going to tell you. So in some ways, there's that very, very clear moral universe of which, you know, man plays a very, very functional role, and the king is absolutely central to that spiritual connection. Cyrus, of course, plays an absolute pivotal role, certainly in the Persian Empire, as the father of the Iranian nation, or the Persian nation, the Persians and the Medes. He's critical in terms of a figure that is seen to have done things differently. And of course, in a Western understanding, we know the figure of Cyrus through both our biblical texts and our classical texts. By and large, most of our understanding of the historical figure of Cyrus is seen through those classical texts and, of course, the Bible. He is one of two messiahs in the Old Testament. Don't forget that, of course. He's one of the two of the Lord's anointed. So he's very popular, obviously, in the Hebrew Bible, hence his popularity in Israel today. But also in the classical world, he was seen by the Greeks very much as the person who knew how to govern. He was the person, if you look, we were speaking earlier about the patchwork, what was it, the 1,000 city-states of the Greek world. Here you had someone who was able to master and bring together a whole range of different peoples under a single authority. And how did he do that, of course? He did that by understanding how to win the peace, something that we've forgotten in the Western world, I have to say. But how to win the peace. It's not a question of simply subjugating the Babylonians. You have to put out a nice Cyrus cylinder that tells you how much I love your God, and you can put him back, and I'm here to protect you, and actually, I'm here to free you. Okay, there's nothing better in terms of mythology than the myth of emancipation. And Cyrus is presented really as the great emancipator, but not just for the Persians. He's seen, obviously, as the person who liberated the Persians. Herodotus says this. But the fact is, wherever he goes, he presents himself as the great emancipator. And that, of course, is a good way of basically hoodwinking people you've just conquered. Okay, to say, I haven't come to conquer you, I've come to free you. Great stuff. Again, in terms of establishing your authority, that is something that I think the Persians did, certainly in this phase, or in this period with Cyrus, did somewhat differently to what came beforehand. I don't want, and just in case any of you, he did not set up the first Charter of Human Rights, by the way, just in case anyone wonders about that. This is where the mythology gets carried away with itself, and I think ruins it, I have to say, because then we're all forced to say what a load of nonsense this is. Of course he wasn't setting up the first Charter of Human Rights. But what he did do was different. And if it wasn't different, figures such as Xenophon, who wrote the Chiropedia, the Education of Cyrus, which became very popular again in the Western world, figures such as Xenophon, would not have been so adulatory about him. There was clearly something quite different about the way in which he operated. So I think it's really about that notion that he operated in a very political sense, not just a military sense, and that he also was able really to construct authority. So here on the right, you see in Persepolis a picture, it's an engraving of the king, again, dealing with the beast that you'll be familiar, of course, in the sort of book of Revelation and others, this sort of Zoroastrian sort of mythical beast that is the sort of identification with evil. The role of the king there is to defeat evil. It's to crush evil. And that's a sort of replication of that. Now, later, in the later Persian imperial setups and the period of both the Parthians and the Sasanians from about 220 AD to 640, you get a further development of many of these ideas that emerge. This frieze is from a place near Persepolis, which I don't know if you can see it very clearly, to be honest, but basically it is the image of the king receiving effectively what is the ring of power from the deity, and the ring of power to convey that bond and that commitment and that oath. It's about basically committing to governing in the right and the just way. So that element of morality is absolutely vital to the way that in which they sort of structure their universe. Justice and the concept of justice and the king as the provider of justice is absolutely central. And a critical element here is also this notion of divine grace. And I want to really specify that because it's not a concept of divine right, and it's not about deifying the monarch. You don't get ideas of deification in the Persian world, not in the same way as you get in the Hellenic and Roman world. What you do get is this notion that the good king, by doing good deeds, enhances his divine grace. And by doing wicked deeds, he loses the divine grace. So you can see in that sort of motif, in a way, it's an interesting dynamic. You're not there forever by divine right just simply because of your birth. You're there because of the deeds that you do. And I think that's quite an important distinction. So if you look actually in Persian mythology and others, and certainly later texts like the Book of Kings that comes afterwards in the Muslim period, as a redaction really of this earlier sort of studies, there are kings who fall. There are kings that are overthrown. There is regicide, for instance. But this is because these kings, through hubris, through performing wicked deeds, basically lose that divine grace. So I won't go through a couple of ideas that clearly come through into the medieval Islamic world. Certainly ideas of religion and the role of religion and kingship are very tied within the Persian world. This is something obviously that in the Muslim Caliphate they borrowed. But I will quickly sort of run through, if I may, some of the more modern conceptions, because people often forget, I was talking to some people in the interval, just how central in many ways these Persian ideas, and certainly the education of Cyrus, was to Western literature, actually, and to Western ideas of good government. Not least, actually, in the founding fathers in the United States. I mean, Jefferson had, I am told, certainly had 2 copies of the Chiropedia. Now, the interesting thing with the Chiropedia is that it is largely seen as mythic, and it is. I mean, it's not really a realistic assessment of Cyrus's life. But increasingly, historians are of the view that actually what Xenophon was doing was really portraying and putting in writing the Persian version of Cyrus's life. And that's quite interesting. It wasn't simply a fictitious account. It wasn't a mirror for princes purely on its own merits. It was something that Xenophon himself had heard. And as we know, Xenophon spent a long time in the service of Cyrus the Younger, who he very much also very admired a great deal. And it's very possible, certainly we couldn't know for a fact, but it's very possible certainly that the tale in Xenophon is that perception of Cyrus the Great that the Persians themselves felt was realistic. But here on the left, you see a book that the Stuarts were very keen on the Chiropedia, not that it did Charles I much good, but there is Charles I's personal copy of the Chiropedia. James I also, or James VI, I should say, was also very keen on learning the lessons of the Chiropedia and what Cyrus represented. Here are tapestries coming from the Spanish royal palaces in Parma, again denoting the life of Cyrus. Again, very central to our notion of what kingship and the ideas of ideal kingship should be. Here, in the politics of Cyrus in the Islamic Republic, just to show you how absurd things can get, and of course, as we say, myths are very powerful drivers of action, but they don't always make sense. In fact, they very rarely make sense, but that's not the point. The point is it appeals to something deeper. Ahmadinejad here on the right, our great firebrand president, awarding Cyrus the Great a medal for great deeds for Islam, or whatever that was. Again, very sort of absurd, but he was a very keen supporter of Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus the Great in the Islamic Republic has become known as the first Muslim. Don't ask. But that's a. Here on the left, on the other hand, is something more interesting, as you'll see at the end, is the fascination of Cyrus the Great among modern Iranians. Modern Iranians view Cyrus the Great as an emblematic and iconic figure for basically everything that is not the Islamic Republic. And if you look at the figure here, he's actually praying to the tomb of Cyrus the Great. If any of you, by the way, do get to go to Iran, do make the effort to go and see the tomb of Cyrus the Great. It is really 2 minutes. It is really something. So I'm going to end on a finale now for your guy. So the tomb is really something to see. It is 4 hours from Shiraz. It's a bit of a hike, but it has, I think, one of the best epigraphs of any tomb, which basically says, "O man, I am Cyrus, who gave an empire to the Persians. Begrudge me not this simple monument," which I think is marvelous. That's what Alexander found, anyway. Don't mention that word in front of me, Alexander. Anyway. So, the politics of Cyrus in the West, of course, very, very popular. Again, in Israel, commemoration. I think Jerusalem is the one city outside Iran that has a Cyrus the Great street. Very popular in Israel. But perhaps the most absurd, really, is Donald Trump as Cyrus the Great, which is represented by this coin issued by some of his supporters, a medallion, I should say, in which it quotes Isaiah, the biblical text really on Cyrus the Great, and draws an analogy. You can't see this, unfortunately, as well. The hair is there. There is also, a figure of Cyrus the Great, although we don't know what he looked like. Of course, we have no idea anything about it. I mean, you can basically put what you want on him. The interesting thing about this, and this is something that maybe Paul at some stage can answer for us, is how popular the term Cyrus is within Puritan societies. I don't know why. It's obviously something in the biblical, but both Obama and Trump were hailed as the new Cyrus. So it was very much viewed as that. I'll stop there, Ulf, because I can see that my authority is waning. Thank you.
we could gladly have listened to more, but we couldn't. This idea of a moral universe, did that have an influence on the shaping of Greek democracy?
Did it have a...
It's a contemporary idea floating around in the region.
I mean, the interesting thing is, and others here in this room I think will know better than me, to be honest, is to what extent you get the influence of Persian ideas, religious ideas on the Greek world. And clearly there are. But it's difficult to know. I mean, you can see with certain writers, that they are borrowing from various Persian ideas. There are some arguments, very controversial, but loved by people in Iran, that Plato in some ways was borrowing very much, and the whole idea of the philosopher king is really very much borrowed from an idea from a Persianate concept. But of course, we can never know that because we don't have texts. I mean, that's the problem. We don't have written literary sources from this period.
Ollie, thank you very much this far. Thank you.